When we want to say that something is backwards and cruel and irrational and dark, we'll often use the term medieval, especially if we are talking about an average person that doesn't know that much about history. And I would say definitely in the mind of an average person, the medieval period is seen as the epitome of backwardness, of religious fanaticism, of a witch burning, which illustrates the irrationality and superstition of the period, as well as the religious fanaticism. The medieval period is seen as a period in which you see king's fools, or jesters as they were called, dancing in front of a king and doing crazy stuff, and then at the other moment the Spanish Inquisition shows up and arrests you, and then they torture you. And the medieval period is seen as this utter epitome of backwardness, religious fanaticism, and cruelty. But and this object, try and guess what this torture machine was used for. And it is also the time when Vlad the Impaler, as his name said, impaled people. But there is only one problem with this idea that medieval period was a period of religious fanaticism and cruelty and backwardness when compared to the Renaissance or the ancient period. And the problem is the fact that it simply isn't true. And I am essentially stealing this thesis from Jacques Le Goff, one of the best historians of the medieval period in Europe. And he actually explains why the medieval period is in fact called the Middle Ages, or often it is called the Dark Ages, although in recent times historians started to use the Dark Ages only for the early Middle Ages, and that actually makes much more sense. There is a good argument to be made that the early Middle Ages truly were the Dark Ages, but I'm going to talk about it a bit later. But okay, so why is it that the Middle Ages are called the Middle Ages? Well, this term, the Middle Ages, was first used by a Renaissance poet, Francesco Petrarca. You can see him on this picture, and he used the term Middle Ages in a derogatory way. What he wanted to say is that the Middle Ages are simply a period that combines glory of the ancient times, the virtue of the ancient philosophers such as Plato and Socrates, with his new period of light and art and rationality that is in opposition to the Middle Ages. And he also saw the Middle Ages as being in opposition to the glory of Rome. But actually the first man that formulated this idea that history is a progress, in a sense that modern times are better than everything that pre-existed them, even the ancient glory of Rome, was Voltaire. According to Voltaire, history, he didn't use this term, the Middle Ages or the New Age. He used four names to describe history. The first period, he said, is the period of Aristotle and Pericles and the Greco-Persian Wars. Then the second period is the period of Caesar and Augustus. The third period, he said, essentially is the period of the Islamic conquest. And he said the fourth period is the best period, that is the period of Louis XIV. That was his period in France. But this idea that history is a progress and that in fact modern times are better even than ancient glory was, yes, first time formulated by Voltaire, but he lived in the 17th century, so we can't really say that this idea of modernity being something good was formulated in the Renaissance. But an important thing did happen in the Renaissance, and that is this idea that this optimism for the future, this idea that the future is better, although it is still just as good as as the ancient, the Roman times. While in the mind of the medieval man, such as St. Augustus, history was seen essentially as a history of decadence and devolution. In the mind of the medieval person, the first generation, Adam and Eve, were the best, and then as humans progressed, they were just drifting further away from God. But okay, so I'm not denying that some very important changes happened in the Renaissance, but where I simply have to agree with Jacques Le Goff is that the transition from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, it has to be the most arbitrary transition that happens in history, because obviously something important happened when Rome fell and something important happened when First World War ended. That is when the modern age began. But did actually in fact something important happen when Columbus discovered America? And Jacques Le Goff argues, well, not actually. Only in the late 16th, actually 17th century, do we truly see the consequences of Columbus discovering America. And this idea that the medieval period is somehow irrational and full of religious war, while the Renaissance or the 16th century is somehow a better period, a period of rationality, well, that this is simply isn't true when you look at the 30 Years' War that actually happened in the 17th century. And the 17th century was in fact a century of holy war. On the one hand, you had Protestants and Catholics slaughtering each other, even scalping each other, and it was a war that killed 40% of the population of the Holy Roman Empire, which the Crusades never managed to do. They never, for example, managed to kill 40% of the Islamic caliphates they were conquering. And yes, here you can see how the 17th century looked like, how the 30 Years' War looked like. And on the other hand, even the Islamic world was experiencing their own form of holy war between Sunnis and Shias. And yeah, that's why it is hard to make an argument that the medieval period was somehow more religious or more religiously violent than the Renaissance, or in fact the early modern age, because the Sunnis and Shias were slaughtering each other with the same ferociousness as the Catholics and Protestants, and the 30 Years' War was just as religious as the Crusades were. And in fact, it is kind of a bizarre accident of history that precisely at the time of the 30 Years' War, the Muslims also had their own form of religious war between a Shiite Persia and the Sunni Ottoman Empire, although in the Muslim world it was also a war of two empires and two countries. But then again, the Crusades can also be seen through the prism of just imperial conquest. Not to mention that even in ancient Rome, the emperor was in fact the main priest of Jupiter. So it's not like Romans were secular, although they were more religiously tolerant than the monotheistic religions of Christianity and Islam. And what Jacques Le Goff also makes clear in his book, that actually questions this the way in which we delineate between the medieval period and the early modern period. He makes the case, well, the European colonization, it did not really impact the world until the late 18th century. So this is the map of European colonialism in the early 18th century, and this is the European colonialism in the late 18th century. So in the 18th century, yes, colonialism truly did. European colonialism, that is, truly did impact the world, and you would be kind of crazy to deny that. But in the year in which Columbus made his discovery, it really did not impact the world. And okay, there is a good counter argument, and that is, well, these delineations, aren't they all kind of just symbolical anyway? Why not then use this year 1492 as a year of delineation? But Legov also makes an argument, well, they are not purely symbolical, the time periods, that is, because if we go back to the fall of the Roman Empire, the fall of the Western Roman Empire wasn't purely symbolical. What happened is that this huge state that existed, although it was a dysfunctional state, suddenly it ceased to exist. New states were formed on the territory of the Western Roman Empire. And what is also important, Legov makes the case, well, for an average person that, for example, lived in the 4th century, which was still the ancient times, the times of Rome, and the person that lived in the late 5th century, the medieval period, there is a big difference in quality of their lives. Or we can even go with a guy that lived in the early 5th century, perhaps in a zone that wasn't affected as much by the barbarian invasion. We can compare his life to the life of a guy from the early 6th century. And there is a big difference, because people in the 6th century, they no longer had, for example, the Roman currency. They could no longer use the Roman infrastructure that was in decay. The levels of education dropped, demographic levels dropped, the birth rates were dropping. You could no longer just freely travel between locations because new states emerged. And yes, the Merovingian Empire that did emerge in the period of the early medieval times, it was unable to unify the territory in the same way. Roman roads for centuries used in the 4th century and even in the early 5th century were now just lying in decay, and for the most part not being used, because trade was pretty much a rare phenomenon in the period of the 6th century or the late 5th century. So Legov makes the case that yes, there was a big difference in a life of a guy that lived in the 4th century or in the early 5th century and the guy that lived in the 6th or the 7th century. And that is the security provided by the Roman Empire was lost, and the state of the Roman Empire no longer existed, and new tribes, often pagan tribes, also started to come into Europe. That was a big change. People suddenly found themselves living in completely new states under new masters. Roman law that was individualistic was replaced by collectivistic, barbaric laws often, although there was a re-emergence of Roman law in some cities. But yes, if somebody lived, for example, for 100 years, they would truly experience an apocalypse in slow motion throughout the period of the 5th century. But this idea that the Renaissance was somehow more progressive than the medieval times, well, it also doesn't hold water, that theory. It has many holes that I'm going to explain a bit later. But let us first return to the past and show why this idea that ancient Rome was somehow more progressive or technologically developed than the medieval period is also a myth. Now, if we are talking about the late medieval period, and by the way, I'm not even talking about the 15th century or the 14th century, I'm talking about 12th century onwards. In many ways, the medieval period of the 12th and 13th century was more developed than ancient Rome. Just look at the trebuchet that in this form was invented in the 12th century. Romans, they only had catapults, and There's even an entire subreddit, Reddit Trebuchet, you can check it out, dedicated to glorification of trebuchets over catapults. And I do agree with their premise. Trebuchets, they are just better. They can throw giant rocks much further than the catapults. Then the longbows, the English longbows, they are invented in 12th century. So again, I'm not talking about something that barely happened in the medieval ages, like the invention of cannons, for example. I'm talking about 12th century English longbows. They were more advanced than anything that Romans had. I'm talking about Roman bows, of course. So these bows would be able to penetrate Roman armor and defeat them in battle, probably. Then just look at these two fellows. I mean, who is going to win? The medieval knight of the, I would say, perhaps the 13th, maybe 14th century, or a Roman horseman? Who is going to win? I mean, I'm betting on this guy, on the left. I mean, Fortune needs to do a new meme, and that is like a beta Roman warrior versus the Chad from the medieval times. And yes, the full plate armor technology was really more advanced in the 13th century than back in the times of the glorious past of the Roman Empire. And again, I'm not saying that military technology is all there is, that it is the most important thing in the world, but it is pretty important. I mean, because of military technology, Europe conquered the rest of the world, and not to mention that medieval people had better boats than Romans. They could storage more food, and that is how they were able to discover America, unlike the Romans. And yes, the Romans, they had smaller boats, which was a problem for discovering America. And the medieval people, they had a compass, which also made traveling easier. So medieval period in many aspects was more technologically advanced than the Roman times. When it came to agriculture, they had better plowing methods than the Romans, which led to them having more food, at least generally speaking, than the Romans. The windmill was discovered in the 12th century, at least in this form. It was. The Romans, they didn't have windmills like this. But okay, let me now make the case for why it is kind of silly to say that Renaissance was this big change that was somehow in opposition to medieval times. Well, in many aspects, life of an average person in the 16th century was often worse than of an average guy from the 15th century. And why is that? Well, even in Western Europe, in countries like France, the flourishment of the banking system led to the bankers buying more land, which essentially made the territories even of France and Western Europe, such as Italy and France, more feudal and more rural than the period of the 15th century that was more urban. But in Eastern Europe, the situation got worse due to the Ottoman conquest, and then resulted in the feudal lords raising taxation on the peasantry, and that's why the 16th century was a century of serf rebellions. And yeah, very brutal serf rebellions happened throughout the 16th century, and inflation caused by gold from the American continent also led to the feudal lords raising taxes. And that is why life of an average person in Europe was worse in the 16th century than in the 15th century. And also these new foods that eventually came to Europe and made average life better, made them have more protein and more energy, such as coffee, potatoes. Well, all of these foods began to be used by an average guy in Europe somewhere in the 18th century, maybe 17th century. Coffee was still not used by an average person until the 18th century. And there even is this bizarre theory that coffee made the Industrial Revolution possible, because then people could stay awake for longer and work in a factory. And coffee, well, I do agree that coffee was a big invention that perhaps did change history, European history, but it practically didn't exist in the Renaissance when it comes to the average guy drinking coffee, even average guy in a city, for example. And what's interesting, Jacques Lagoff also makes the case that an average French peasant that even wasn't that affected by the Ottomans had less protein on average in the 16th century than in the 15th century. And unfortunately, he doesn't really explain why was that the case, but if you have more data about it, I would like to know. But yeah, an interesting observation. And the best argument that the year of 1492 was actually an important year is the fact that in that year Arabs were finally expelled from Spain, the end of the Reconquista. And it also resulted in Jews being expelled due to Christian fanaticism. But although that was an important event, it wasn't an event that actually truly affected most of Europe. Really, it affected Spain. But here I agree with Jacques Lagoff. If you have to choose an important event that happened in that year and that did affect an average person, at least in a sense that now they could finally say that Arabs were expelled from Europe, then that year is much more important than the year in which Columbus discovered America, because Columbus in fact didn't even know that he discovered America. He thought he discovered India, essentially. Not even discovered, he just thought he was in India. That was his take on the situation. And finally, Lagoff makes the case that Shakespeare, that became a symbol of the Renaissance, if you look at his philosophy and his art, was pretty much a medieval person. All of his, or almost all of his work is not about the glory of the ancient period. Most of his work is about medieval legends, such as the Viking saga of Hamlet, the Viking warrior, or the legend of Henrik V conquering France. And even his humor and the creatures that appear in his tales are the mythology of medieval Europe. And that is why Lagoff makes the case that Shakespeare was definitely a medieval type of a guy. And finally, he proposes a new delineation. And he says, well, capitalism, it emerged in the 17th century. And why is that? Because in the 17th century, for the first time, we had companies such as Dutch East Indian Company that were more powerful than entire states that existed in Europe. And that was truly a new phenomenon. This company pretty much on their own colonized entire Indonesia, and then later the Dutch people nationalized the company. So this form of colonization was truly something else, something that existed only in capitalism, which is why he actually proposes the 17th century to be like this century of something new happening, of this new period beginning because of the emergence of capitalism. But he also makes the case, well, maybe why not go with the French Revolution as the beginning of this new era, because only with the French Revolution did we truly get a new type of philosophy, a new type of a man being born. This idea of universal equality, of this idea that feudalism is bad, it really didn't exist in the 16th century. Well, okay, that's all for this video, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and see you in the next one.